On May 28, 1967, former Beatles press officer Derek Taylor was invited to a party at band manager Brian Epstein's home in London, just days before the release of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. In 1965, Derek had left the band and moved to California. Despite being over 6,000 miles away, he decided that this was a party he just could not miss. When he landed in London, the Beatles were there at the airport to greet him, but Derek was shocked to find that they were not at all the Beatles he used to know. There they stood before him, disheveled, wide-eyed, wearing colorful silken clothes adorned with ornaments. Their brains seemed somewhat apart from their bodies, and yet they were not drunk or reeling or grinding their teeth. The other passengers stood and stared, and so did we. It was to be a party to remember.
9.
It is April 4th, 1967. Paul McCartney and band roadie Mal Evans fly out to the United States to surprise Paul's girlfriend, Jane Asher, who is currently touring the U.S. with the Old Vic Company, and where she is performing as Juliet in, you guessed it, Romeo and Juliet. Tomorrow is her 21st birthday. Paul and Mal arrive in San Francisco. When they do, it is snowing. San Francisco's first snow in 42 years. After a quick rest to smoke pot with Jefferson Airplane, one pill makes you larger, they now fly to Denver. It is there they will meet with Jane. That night they party, and the next day Mal drives them up into the Rockies, where they spend an idyllic afternoon, as recounted by Mal in his travel diary. Took charge of a Hertz rented car. Drove Paul and Jane up into the Rockies for what I can only describe as a real magical mystery trip. Pulled off the road and parked amongst the so-green trees. Down a rocky gorge to river. Ended up paddling in the cold running water. This evening everyone more than ready for a big meal and a fair helping of color television. It is now the 7th of April. Paul is filming Jane Asher walking through a grove of trees when suddenly there pops into his head his next big idea. A movie. Not just any movie, with a director and a production crew like A Hard Day's Night or Help, but something different, something strange. A piece of guerrilla filmmaking that would be called Magical Mystery Tour. I used to do a lot of amateur filming, and from my interest in that, it was a very small step for me to say, well, if we hired a film cameraman and we told him where to shoot, then we're starting to film, aren't we? So the idea tumbled together that we'd hire a bus, take a bunch of people out, and start trying to make up something about a magical mystery tour. It used to just be called a mystery tour. Up north. When we were kids, you'd get on a bus, and you didn't always know where you were going, but nearly always it was Blackpool. The origin of Magical Mystery Tour is very much rooted in Paul's prior exposure to avant-garde filmmaking. I've covered much of this period of Paul's life and his integration into the London art scene in a prior video, so if you are interested in learning more, check out that video. Paul McCartney's good friend, Barry Miles, and Jane Asher's brother, Peter, were both owners of the Indica bookstore, where they hosted a variety of exhibitions, including Yoko Ono's unfinished paintings and objects, which was where she would first meet John Lennon. A steady stream of artists moved through the space, many who had dipped their fingers in the world of home filmmaking. So Paul himself began making little films, as well as home sound recordings such as those utilized in Tomorrow Never Knows. Paul would spend a little over a week in America. After watching Jane perform in Romeo and Juliet, Paul and Mal would fly to Los Angeles, where among other fun, Paul would contribute to Brian Wilson's Vegetables. So I'm gonna chop down my vegetables high. His huge contribution being the sound of him chewing celery. On the 12th, Paul finally returned to England. Almost immediately, he broached the movie idea to both John and Brian Epstein.
The Magical Mystery Tour was another where he'd set it up. He'd worked it out with Mal, and then he came and showed me what his idea was, and this is how it went. It went around like this, the story, and he had it all, I think, production, and he says, well, here's the segment, you write a little piece for that. And I thought, fucking hell, I've never made a film, what do you mean? He said, write a script. So, I ran off and wrote the dream sequence for the fat woman and all the thing with the spaghetti and all that.
Sitting next to Brian on the big settee in his living room, Paul had him look over all aspects of the project. Paul, on his own, had organized the whole of the film into a pie chart divided into segments. He had Brian translate this into specific timetables of booked studios, rehearsal halls, rented equipment, tea for 45 people, and everything else they needed. Occasionally, Brian would interrupt to say that one of the other Beatles could add something to a scene. He was very concerned that they all had an equal part of the action. We must find more for Ringo to do. George could do a song here. He appeared very enthusiastic and excited about the plan. The Beatles were no longer touring, and Sgt. Pepper had not yet been released, so Brian had very little to do on their behalf. With the idea now fully set in stone, Paul immediately jumped into action, as on the 25th of April, just 4 days after finishing Sgt. Pepper, he came into the studio with a new song, one written specifically for the film, a song of course titled Magical Mystery Tour. Because those were psychedelic times, it had to become a magical mystery tour, a little bit more surreal than the real ones to give us license to do it. But it employs all the circus and fairground barkers, roll up, which was also a reference to rolling up a joint. Much of this day was spent rehearsing and improvising the song, with Paul McCartney at the piano suggesting ideas to the others in the group. It's been said that the others were not nearly as enthusiastic as Paul. They recorded 3 takes of the basic rhythm track, 2 guitars, piano, and drums. After this, they raided the Abbey Road sound effects collection, creating a tape loop of the sound of coaches to be added at the mixing stage. On Wednesday, Paul overdubbed his bass line. Next to be overdubbed was a variety of percussive elements, including maracas and cowbell. To attain a particular sound, the vocal segment of was taped very slowly, so that when played normally, the vocals sounded fast and frantic. According to engineer Richard Lush, they really wanted those vocals to sound different. On Saturday the 29th, John attended an event at the Alexandra Palace, a benefit party for the newspaper International Times called the 14-Hour Technicolor Dream. The event was headlined by Pink Floyd, with many artists performing, including Soft Machine, Arthur Brown, and Yoko Ono. Now came the time for the brass overdubs. Paul McCartney was humming to the musicians the notes he wanted, recalled engineer Malcolm Addy, trying for a long time to get his thoughts across to them. In the end, we had to send the trumpet players off for tea, while Paul and George worked things out on the Studio 3 piano. Let's hear now from brass musician Philip Jones, who wasn't present at the session, but had friends who were, including player Gary Haworth. Gary Haworth got so fed up with them not knowing what they wanted that he wrote something out for them himself. It was his idea they used. He was not credited for his contribution. The Beatles did not return to the studio until Tuesday the next week, where they spent some 7 hours working on an untitled, never-released jam, only 16 minutes of which was recorded during the session. It featured detuned electric guitars, plus harmonium and drums. It is not believed to be a very remarkable recording. Today, the Beatles recorded not at EMI, but at Olympic Sound Studios, a studio which the Rolling Stones had taken to recording at. The song to be tackled today was both a John and Paul composition. Baby, You're a Rich Man, a song composed of two halves, the verses belonging to John and the chorus to Paul. In the late 1960s, the beautiful people was a term adopted by California hippies to refer to themselves, which Paul's friend Barry Miles says John picked up while reading the newspapers. It has also been speculated that the term could have been fresh on his mind after attending the very hippie 14-hour Technicolor Dream. Paul's chorus, Baby You're a Rich Man, as written in Steve Turner's 1999 A Hard Day's Right, is thought to be a reference to their manager Brian Epstein, though this has never been confirmed by Paul himself. This has been further speculated on due to John Lennon's notorious parody of the chorus in studio recordings where he sang, Baby You're a Rich blank Jew, seeing as Brian was Jewish and gay. The session was engineered by Keith Grant, who by all accounts pushed the Beatles far faster than they were accustomed, as they remarked that this was the fastest record they ever made, though they were probably referring in the more recent sense, seeing as they had recorded more than a couple 1 to 3 take recordings in their early days. Tape operator George Kientz recalled the engineer's reaction to John's vocal performance on this day. They were both amazed at John Lennon's voice. They'd been wondering what it would be like to record, and they were saying how great it was. They couldn't believe anyone could sing that well.
What did you see when you were there? Nothing that doesn't show.
The song has a unique flavor to it, and features an instrument never yet featured in a Beatles song, or used ever again, as far as I can tell. A clavier line, a type of electronic keyboard which was monophonic, meaning it could only play one note at a time, but had an interesting sound. One last note on the session. Present during the recording was Mick Jagger, who may or may not have contributed backing vocals in the last chorus, but probably not. Back at their home studio of EMI, the Beatles went to work on a song specifically written for Yellow Submarine, Paul's All Together Now. It's really a children's song. I had a few young relatives and I would sing songs for them. I used to do a song for kids called Jumping Round the Room, very similar to All Together Now. It's a play-away command song for children, and it was a very simple recording, taking only 9 takes, with John throwing in some fun harmonica for good measure. On Monday the 15th, following a dinner party hosted at Brian Epstein's, Paul McCartney would end up going by the Bag O' Nails Club, where jazz musician Georgie Fame was performing. The Beatles were regular visitors to the club, Paul especially, who had his own private table. This would turn out to be an extremely pivotal night in Paul's life, as it was on this night he would meet his future wife, Linda Eastman. Now let's just try and forget that Paul was still very much in a committed relationship with Jane Asher at this point, so we can appreciate this heartwarming meet-cute. Here's Paul. The night I met Linda, I was in the Bag O' Nails watching Georgie Fame and the Blue Flames play a great set. She was there with the Animals, who she knew from photographing them in New York. They were sitting a couple of alcoves down, near the stage. The band had finished and they got up to either leave or go for a drink or a pee or something, and she passed our table. I was near the edge and stood up just as she was passing, blocking her exit, and so I said, "Oh, sorry. Hi, how are you? How are you doing?" I introduced myself and said, "We're going on to another club after this. Would you like to join us?" That was my big polling line. Well, I'd never used it before, of course, but it worked this time. It was a fairly slim chance, but it worked. She said, "Yes, okay, we'll go on." So by all accounts, this was simply a night of flirtation, if we can trust them. Though there is no doubt that Linda made an immediate and distinct impression on Paul, who would be seeing her once again in the very near future. You Know My Name, Look Up the Number is one of the stranger Beatles songs ever recorded. The simplest way I can think of describing the song is as a recurring inside joke. John had arrived one night with this song, which was basically a mantra. You know my name, look up the number. It was John's original idea, and that was the complete lyric. He brought it in originally as a 15-minute chant when he was in Space Cadet mode, and we said, well, what are we going to do with this then? According to John, I was waiting for him in his house, and I saw the phone book was on the piano with, you know the name, look up the number. That was like a logo, and I just changed it. If you've seen my Making of Abbey Road video, you know that this song would not be finished until over 2 years later, but the general outline was already in their heads, as in this rhythm track recording the song changed forms multiple times, running the gamut of genre and pastiche. It's also funny listening to the track knowing that it was born during the year of psychedelia, as while it wouldn't sound out of place on the White Album, imagining it next to Sgt. Pepper's or Magical Mystery Tour is quite the stark contrast. Paul has said this was one of his favorite Beatles songs, just due to how much fun they had making it. On Friday, May 19th, at his home at 24 Chapel Street, Brian Epstein hosted a huge press launch for the upcoming release of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. It was a colorful night, with dozens of journalists, broadcasters, and photographers, including, you guessed it, Linda Eastman. According to Linda, I took my portfolio over to Brian Epstein's office and left it with his assistant, Peter Brown. Peter Brown got back in touch and said that Brian had liked my portfolio and invited me to a press launch for Sgt. Pepper at Brian's home. So I went to the press launch where Sgt. Pepper was played for the first time to the media to take my first photographs of the Beatles. Because I was so used to working almost exclusively with black and white, I didn't have any color film with me and had to get some from another photographer. I eventually sold a color print of the Beatles from this session for $100, and I thought I had it made. Linda never specified when she had left her portfolio with Peter Brown. Did Paul have any influence in Linda's attendance at the party? Maybe. Probably not, as she had obviously had plenty of experience already as a photographer, and was well known in the New York music scene. But regardless, there are several photos of them looking rather comfortable together. The press launch was a huge success. On May 20th, BBC disc jockey Kenny Everett gave the official preview of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band on the radio show Where It's At, which included pre-recorded interviews from Paul, John, and Ringo.
Our commentator, John Lennon.
We're sitting in the hushed semicircular theatre waiting for the Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band to come on, and here they come now, playing the first number. Let's go!
All right. I can't do it for them all, man. I'll be dizzy.
Well, by George, in the studio we have old Ringo Starr of the Beatles fame. Ringo, what have you been doing since I last saw you in America a year ago?
Very much.
Really?
Well, I went on holiday, we made an LP, we've made a few more tracks, we've sort of been busy.
What do you think of this new LP? It's a bit strange compared to the others. Would you term it psychedelic?
Only if you want to think of it as psychedelic.
Talking about things psychedelic and weird sounds, of which this album is full of them, here's one of the most instantly beautiful tracks of the whole thing.
Now I'd like to play you one. That's a sad little song. Where's it gone? Oh, this is it, yeah. Picture yourself on an old-fashioned elephant. Lucy in the sky for everyone. Now.
However, Everett was informed that there was one song he could not play, A Day in the Life. In a letter, BBC Director of Sound Broadcast wrote, I never thought the day would come when we would have to put a ban on an EMI record, but sadly, this is what has happened over this track. We have listened to it over and over again with great care, and we cannot avoid coming to the conclusion that the words, I'd love to turn you on, followed by that mounting montage of sound, could have a rather sinister meaning. The recording may have been made in innocence and good faith, but we must take account of the interpretation that many young people would inevitably put upon it. Turned on is a phrase which can be used in many different circumstances, but is currently much in vogue in the jargon of the drug addicts. We do not feel that we can take the responsibility of appearing to favor or encourage those unfortunate habits, and that is why we shall not be playing the recording in any of our programs, radio or television. I expect we shall meet with some embarrassment over this decision, which has already been noted by the press. We will do our best not to appear to be criticizing your people, but as you will realize, we do find ourselves in a very difficult position. I thought you would like to know why we have, most reluctantly, taken this decision. A decision that the Beatles, obviously, disagreed with. In talking with reporters, Paul said, "The BBC have misinterpreted this song. It has nothing to do with drug taking. It's only about a dream." John added, "The laugh is that Paul and I wrote this song from a headline in a newspaper. It's about a crash and its victim. How anyone can read drugs into it is beyond me." Everyone seems to be falling overboard to see the word drug in the most innocent of phrases, which, while the bulk of the song may have no relation to drug use, it has been reiterated by Paul multiple times that the line, "I'd love to turn you on," specifically, was most definitely a deliberate drug reference.
And then we got to what was going to lead into the middle. And we kind of looked at each other and kind of knew we were being a little bit kind of edgy. And we sort of said, "I'd love to turn you on." So we kind of knew, like, this would have an effect.
So suffice to say, the boys were playing a bit coy here. It's All Too Much is about as druggy as any Beatles song, and it was first thought up by George during an LSD trip. It's All Too Much was written in a childlike manner from realizations that appeared during and after some LSD experiences, and which were later confirmed in meditation. We once again see Indian influence in the composition of this work, as the whole of the song is built around a droning of the G chord. It's All Too Much borrowed a couple of small pieces from other songs. It contains a couplet from the Mercies' 1966 single, Sorrow. It also contained a short motif from Jeremiah Clark's Prince of Denmark's March, also known as Trumpet Voluntary. I just wanted to write a rock and roll song about the whole psychedelic thing of the time. The song was specifically recorded for inclusion on the Yellow Submarine soundtrack. It's a unique song, very much steeped in George's Indian influence, but still of a far more prototypical rock influence than, say, Love You Too or Within You and Without You. The Beatles once again recorded outside of their home base of EMI Studios. As they rolled into Del & Lee Studios, they rehearsed the song quite extensively before putting down 4 takes of a basic rhythm track composed of organ, lead guitar, drums and bass, and the song at this point ran for over 8 minutes. 2 days before the scheduled release of Sgt. Pepper's, Brian Epstein decided to again host another rager of a party, but this time, the press was not invited. This party would mark the reintegration of former press officer to the Beatles, Derek Taylor, back into their inner circle, and he would end up being appointed press officer for the newly formed Apple label in 1968. He and his wife, Joan, were off in Monterey, California, setting up for the International Pop Festival. Despite receiving just 2 days' notice before the party, the two decided to make the 6,000-mile trip back to England to attend. At the airport, the Taylors were met by John, George, Ringo, Terry Duran, and Barry Finch of design collective The Fool. To find them all disheveled and half out of their minds, having stayed up all night before in what George described as an all-night or all-week, bells on the knees, and perms in the hair LSD trip. They were all dressed in full psychedelic costume, silk and satin clothes, embellished with scarves and bells and other ornaments. The 3 Beatles came up to Derek, and very uncharacteristically of their prior physical relations with Derek, showered him in hugs and kisses rather than the curt northern greetings he had been accustomed to. "This is the new thing," John told him. "You hug your friends when you meet them and show them you're glad to see them. Don't stand there shaking hands as if everyone's got some disease. Get close to people." The Taylors were ushered into John's Rolls Royce, which of course was painted to be extremely colorful. As they set off for Weybridge, George snatched a cigarette from Taylor's mouth and threw it out of the window. "You don't need them. They'll poison you." George, as we all know, would never smoke another cigarette in his life. Where's Paul, you may ask? Well, Jane Asher is finally back from the United States, so he is abstaining from the madness to spend some quality time with her and be on his best behavior, for once. The group made a pit stop at George's estate at Kinfon's before the party, and then in 3 separate cars, the whole group made the ride to Brian's home. It was going to be a wild night. Cynthia Lennon shares her perspective. It had all the feeling of a school outing. Every time the car passed through town or villages, it stopped the traffic. Crowds of jeering, waving people pressed up against the tinted windows trying to get a better look at the occupants of this crazy car. It was like traveling in a time machine. The boys were smoking pot, and even if you don't smoke it yourself, breathing in the fumes can affect you in much the same way. A pill was passed around and everyone giggled stupidly and had a nibble. It was very hard for me to explain what the atmosphere was like in the car at that time. I can only describe it as insane, freaky, self-destructive, irresponsible, a contagious mood that spread like wildfire in the dark. The party was to be a surreal spectacle of sensory overload. The roads leading to Brian's were adorned with colorful balloons. On arrival, the group was served some special tea. John, who had been sitting with us on the lawn, said he'd just given Joan some acid in her tea. Would I like some in mine? Sure, why not? He snapped the tablet in 2, gave me a portion about 2/3 of the total. "That'll do to start with," he said cheerfully, dropping the tiny jagged pink pill into my cup. "Stir it up well. There's a good lad." George came by and said, "What are you giving them?" "What do you think?" said John. "Oh," said George, but I had already drained it, and George's tea too. Derek's already had, well, it's too late now. Derek's got a double dose inside him. Derek had now taken 500 micrograms of LSD, which, if you aren't aware, is a fuck ton. They retreated to a room with a log fire burning. A joint was passed around, and more tea was served. Derek Taylor, not knowing what to expect from the acid, took a Desbutal tablet, amphetamine combined with barbiturate, just in case there wasn't enough stimulation. Before long, I found myself swimming like a parcel of Escher lizards through the lines of a purple jigsaw of increasing and then decreasing size. "What the hell's going on?" I asked, crying with laughter. "You're tripping," said Joan, with a new vocabulary already. "Tripping? Me? Are you tripping?" I asked Joan. She nodded lovingly. "We all are," George said. "Everyone is." Unsurprisingly, things began to go wrong. Derek Taylor began to have a bad trip. George, himself familiar enough with them, recognized the warning signs and did what he could to provide some reassurance to Derek. "Derek, create and preserve the image of your choice. It's up to you. The thing is to see what you want to see. Do you want to create something nice? Then look into the fire and see something nice." Which, by Derek's account, did the trick, and he enjoyed himself the rest of the night. Coping less well was Cynthia Lennon, who was on what was to be her 3rd and final trip. Unlike Derek, Cynthia had nobody to comfort and guide her, and John was not doing much better. When John moved away from me, I followed, hoping that he could in some way comfort and support me. But John was not happy. He was not enjoying the experience as he had before. He ignored me and glared as though I were an intruding stranger. This dissociation and rejection from John, at the peak of her trip and vulnerability, led Cynthia's mind into an incredibly dark place as she retreated into a bedroom. I felt desolate. I was drifting off into a very deep depression when someone called my name and I was snapped out of my apathetic reverie. Even though I was under the influence of the drug, I knew that all hope for John and I carrying on with our marriage in the same vein flew out of that upstairs window with my thoughts. The trip and the party itself eventually ended, with all unharmed, though not unscathed. On the 31st, the Beatles recorded additional overdubs for It's All Too Much, and then finally, on June 1st, came what may have been the largest and most anticipated album release, possibly ever. It was a work like never before seen, from the music, to the artwork and sleeve, to its total encapsulation of psychedelia at its peak, the Beatles themselves a massive part of the movement. But this is a Magical Mystery Tour video, so we'll get into all of that more when we cover Sgt. Pepper's. What we'll cover instead is the band's recording session that occurred on this day, as they returned once again to Del and Lee's studios, where they spent some long hours jamming and playing aimlessly, perhaps just blowing off some steam. The tape has never been released, but Beatles historian Mark Lewison was given the privilege of listening and quite scathingly described it as nothing but untitled, unplanned, highly tedious, and frankly, amateurish instrumental jams. The single-minded channeling of their great talent so evident on Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band did seem, for the moment, to have disappeared. For the sake of brevity, we are going to fly through this next week, which was spent on brass overdubs for All Too Much, and then several days devoted to overdubbing You Know My Name, Look Up the Number, including saxophone played by Brian Jones of the Rolling Stones. He arrived at Abbey Road in his big Afghan coat, Paul would recall. He was always nervous, a little insecure, and he was really nervous that night because he's walking in on a Beatles session. He was nervous to the point of shaking, lighting ciggy after ciggy. I used to like Brian a lot. I thought it would be a fun idea to have him, and naturally I thought he'd bring a guitar along to a Beatles session, and maybe chug along and do some nice rhythm guitar, or a little bit of electric 12-string or something. But to our surprise, he brought his saxophone. He opened up his sax case and started putting a reed in and warming up, playing a little bit. He was a really ropey sax player, so I thought, aha, we've got just the tune. On the 4th of June, Paul and George stopped over by the Bag o' Nails to watch Jimi Hendrix perform in what was one of his first London gigs, and he would open with Sgt. Pepper's. Here's Paul again. The curtains flew back and he came walking forward, playing Sgt. Pepper. And it had only been released on the Thursday, so that was like the ultimate compliment. To think that that album had meant so much to him, as to actually do it by Sunday night, 3 days after the release. It's a pretty major compliment in anyone's book. I put that down as one of the great honors of my career. And so, we finally reach Wednesday, June 14th, where work begins on an incredibly iconic, if not terribly beloved, Beatles track named All You Need Is Love. Just about a month prior, on May 17th, the Beatles, at the behest of Brian Epstein, signed a contract committing to represent the BBC and Britain in a worldwide satellite broadcast on Sunday, the 25th of June. The name of this broadcast was Our World, and was the very first worldwide broadcast of this nature. 4 communications satellites were utilized, and the show would reach between 400 to 700 million people. But apparently none of this meant all that much to the Beatles. Jeff Emerick would recall, I don't know if they had prepared any ideas, but they left it very late to write the song. John said, "Oh God, is it that close? I suppose we'd better write something." Of the song, Paul would say, All You Need Is Love was John's song. I threw in a few ideas, as did the other members of the group, but it was largely ad-libs like singing She Loves You. It was a good song that we had handy that had an anthemic chorus. And Brian Epstein, despite his prior stress at the boys' clear procrastination, was very pleased with the result. This is an inspired song, because they wrote it for a worldwide program, and they really wanted to give the world a message. It could hardly have been a better message. It is a wonderful, beautiful, spine-chilling record. They were at Olympia Sound Studios today, continuing their trend of studio hopping, and spent time on the basic rhythm track, but not with their usual set of tools. John played the harpsichord, Paul, the upright bass, and George even dabbled on the violin. Ringo, for his part, stuck to the drums. On June 16th, American magazine Life ran an article titled The New Far Out Beatles. It featured an interview by Paul McCartney that had been taken all the way back in February during the recording of Sgt. Pepper's. And in this interview, Paul very openly admitted not only to the Beatles' use of marijuana, but LSD as well. We will now read an excerpt of writing from Alastair Taylor, band manager and assistant to Brian Epstein, recounting the day that this interview took place. I had been asked round to see Paul at Cavendish Avenue, but when I arrived, the security gates were firmly shut, and I couldn't raise an answer on the security intercom. But I knew Paul was in because I could hear his voice. I was forced to resort to climbing over the wall. Not very dignified for a smart-suited executive. I scrambled down inside the large and elegant gardens, and, to my horror, I heard Paul cheerfully confessing to using marijuana because he found it so relaxing. My heart sank into my shiny shoes when I realized the guy he was talking to was a reporter, with as much confidence and authority as I could muster, which was pretty well zero. I tried to interrupt this impromptu press conference, which I was convinced was instantly going to burst the bubble of popularity the Beatles had inflated. Paul? I bumbled. Could I have a word? It's okay, Al. It's cool, said Paul without removing the easy grin from his face. But I'm not sure that Brian would. It's okay, Al. Relax. It's time the truth came out. I was horrified because at this time there had been accusations and colorful stories and all the rest of it, but none of the Beatles had stood up and admitted that they used illegal drugs. Paul clearly thought the time for this hypocrisy was over, and the reporter's notebook was by now twitching nervously in case this scoop was going to be snatched away from him. Paul introduced me to the reporter and told me to relax, and carried on telling the world how much the Beatles enjoyed smoking cannabis. It did create a storm, but the Beatles weathered it easily, and I came to realize the extent of Paul's talent for public relations. He hadn't talked to Brian or the other three before going public, and for all the notice he took of my nervous warnings, I might as well have stayed on the other side of the wall. Despite eventually blowing over, this admission by Paul did not earn him any goodwill from Brian or the other Beatles, who, from their perspective, felt Paul was bringing undue attention to the matter. According to Brian, Paul rang me one Saturday afternoon to tell me that he had admitted to the press that he had taken LSD. I was very worried. I don't think I slept that night, and I thought about it all the following day. But the world moved at a different pace those days. The piece would run in Life magazine nearly 4 months after the interview took place. It then took a couple of days after for the news to really hit the UK. But when it did, it hit hard. International television news immediately reached out to Paul, who was forthright and very calmly gave the following statement.
Don't you believe that this was a matter which you should have kept private?
But the thing is, that I was asked a question by a newspaper, and the decision was whether to tell a lie or to tell him the truth, I really didn't want to say anything, because if I'd had my decision, if I had it my way, I wouldn't have told anyone, because I'm not trying to spread the word about this. But the man from the newspaper is the man from the mass medium, I'll keep it a personal thing. If he does too, if he keeps it quiet.
But you're a public figure, and you said it in the first place, and you must have known that it would have made the newspapers.
Yes, but to say it, is only to tell the truth. I'm telling the truth, I don't know what everyone's so angry about.
Well, do you think you have now encouraged your fans to take drugs?
I don't think it'll make any difference, I don't think my fans are going to take drugs just because I did, But the thing is, that's not the point anyway, I was asked whether I had or not. And then from then on, the whole bit about how far it's going to go and how many people it's going to encourage is up to the newspapers and up to you, on television. I mean, you're spreading this now at this moment. This is going into all the homes, in Britain. And I'd rather it didn't, But you're asking me the question. You want me to be honest. I'll be honest,
And the next week would bring a flurry of controversy and newspaper clippings debating the issue and Paul's responsibility, or lack thereof, of sharing this information, especially considering the Beatles' unprecedented influence on the youth of the world. On the same day the ITN interview ran, the Beatles were in the studio, still working, All You Need Is Love. On Friday, the orchestra was brought into the studio, and they would spend the next couple of days rehearsing their part, as well as recording overdubs. And on Saturday, it was decided that not only would All You Need Is Love be performed for the BBC broadcast, it would also be released as the next single. So then arrives the big day. Just a regular old performance. No stress, right? Horrendous, recalled Jeff Emmerich. There's no two ways about it. To attempt to record what we recorded without the link-up was ridiculous. The Beatles had spent much of the day rehearsing the song while the engineers and BBC affiliates stressed away with the technical aspects, running cables from cameras to an outdoor broadcast van. The performance was to be a mixture of pre-recorded and live backing, the latter which included the vocals, bass guitar, guitar solo, drums, and orchestra. Making sure the sound came through to the world correctly fell directly onto the engineering team, specifically Jeff Emmerich and George Martin. It was getting very panicky by transmission time. Anything could have gone wrong, recalled engineer Peter Vince, who was thankful to be on the sidelines that day. The broadcast actually began 40 seconds earlier than scheduled, and Emmerich and Martin had to rush to shove a bottle of whiskey under the mixing console as the broadcast began. Despite the nerves and anxiety, it went off without a hitch. The crews and guests left and went home, but the Beatles stayed behind to complete a few more finishing touches, including re-recording some of John's vocals for the song.
All you need is love, love. Love is all you need.
With that, they were ready to quickly remix and tape together this song, and they had it pretty much ready for release by the end of the next day. On July 7th, the song, with its B-side, Baby You're a Rich Man, released. It, of course, quickly reached #1 all around the globe. Did somebody say vacation? Thank God. Wait, we're buying an island? Next time, on part 1.5 of the Making of Magical Mystery Tour, we will have a short video recounting the Beatles' vacation in Greece, in the middle of a military dictatorship takeover, and their attempt, spearheaded by John, to purchase an island there. Want more Beatles? I have a Patreon. Right now, I am doing a series with my girlfriend, a new Beatles fan, where we discuss every album, one by one. You can join for $2 a month, or just $1 a month if you're only interested in watching videos early. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, give it a like, pretty please. And if you want to see more videos like this, or old videos like this, consider subscribing and watching more. Thank you so much.